So, you want to be a real estate investor, but where do you start? How do you know what information and sources to trust? That's where I come in. I'm Jonny Cattani, and this is the Investor Relations Real Estate Podcast. Hey guys, real quick, before we start, go to investwithcattani.com and download my free ebook, Is Commercial Real Estate Recession Proof? Now to today's show. What's up, guys, and welcome to another episode of the Investor Relations Real Estate Podcast. I'm your host, Jonny Cattani, and I'm joined today by Chris Tanner. Chris is the Senior Sales and Education Manager at New Direction Trust Company. Chris specializes in showing people how to use retirement funds for alternative investments like real estate, private equity, and cryptocurrency. Chris, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks, Jonny. How's it going today?
Doing very well. We were having a nice conversation offline. Excited to get to it today. This is definitely a topic that not enough people know about, right? What is it, like $39 trillion in self-directed funds? So just a few shekels out there that could be invested.
No doubt. And we might get into this, but a little less than 3% of that is invested outside of Wall Street. So virtually all that 39 trillion you mentioned is invested in Wall Street stuff, stocks, bonds, mutual funds, things like that.
Gosh, that's crazy. Well, I definitely want to get into it, but as we do with all of our guests, let's kind of go all the way back to the beginning. I know you mentioned you're personally an investor as well, but kind of touch on that, you know, how you started investing and what led you to where you're at now.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So I came from a very different background. I was in sales and I was in pharmaceutical sales, which, you know, on the surface, it's great income and you get a company car. There's a lot of perks. But what they don't tell you is that there's a lot of ups and downs. And I mention that because I think you'll have listeners in this situation where I went through 3 different layoffs over the course of 13 years and had a lot of scares along the way. At the time, I had young children, and I came very quickly to the realization that I can't just depend on this W-2 job, even though it was a great job, because if I get laid off or, you know, whatever happens, I got to have another source of income. So that was kind of the start, as I was actually laid off, and it was a wake-up call for me. And that's when I began to just read books. This was back in the days when we had cassette tapes. So this is the early 2000s. We're going back almost 20 years, believe it or not.
Wow.
And so that's kind of how it started. I just, whatever I got my hands on that I could grab. And I was always drawn to real estate. And at the end of the day, that was the direction I ended up going. And I also learned that I could use retirement funds, and it timed out well because I didn't have a lot of personal money, but because of my job, I had money sitting in a retirement account. So some of my very first deals I did because that's where the money was. I had it in my retirement funds. I didn't have the money personally. And so that's what got me into the whole idea of these self-directed retirement plans.
Wow, that's awesome. And that's great that you recognize that earlier, like where is my capital? Oh, here it is. So what was the education like back then, and, you know, the process for using it to invest in alternative assets?
You know, so probably the first book I picked up, and you're probably familiar with Robert Kiyosaki, and probably your listeners will be too. I picked up a book called Retire Young, Retire Rich, and it just shifted my mindset. So he was kind of a starting point. And then, oh gosh, there was this Robert Allen, No Money Down. I mean, I'm dating myself, but anything I could get my hands on, I would. And I literally was going to the local public library. We didn't have meetup groups. We didn't have these, you know, what you're doing. We didn't have podcasts. So I was literally picking up physical books and cassette tapes. I was in pharmaceutical sales, so I had a lot of road time, and I was listening to stuff. And some of it was just general financial education. So I was reading stuff by Warren Buffett, you know, those kind of folks, but just trying to get as much information into my head as possible. That's what it looked like back in the day.
Wow, that's awesome. But that's great that at least there was material available that you could you could go through. And of course, that's part of why podcasts have taken off so much, because a lot of people spending time in their car, audiobooks, and that are, huge now, of course. So hence why I started the podcast. But let's kind of get into some of that stuff now. What is it that you guys are doing? What kind of materials are you putting out there? And what's a great way things people can do to really learn and utilize these accounts correctly?
Yeah. And so just a kind of a very brief, simple explanation. We already kind of mentioned that 97% of retirement funds that are in the US anyway, they're publicly traded securities, but there will always be people who want to put their money into things like real estate, precious metals, some of the things you mentioned earlier in the show. So what we really do is we just provide education, what we're doing right now. We just help show people, hey, you don't necessarily have to have all your money over there. You have the option to bring it and do some other things with it. So obviously we do that through a lot of different ways. We're doing one right now, right? And we teach CE classes. We've got a website. We do a lot of partnering with what I would call business partners. So like, I know you run Cattani Capital Group, and we might do something in the future where we're talking to investors about the possibility of using retirement funds. So we'll do meetings and webinars and things of that nature as well. But we're like any other company. Please come visit us. New Direction. If you Google us, you'll find our website.
Awesome. I love it. Yeah, I guess I kind of skipped ahead there. So let's kind of go back a little bit. Let's, I guess, give a high level here. What can people use this for? What do they not know right now? Like, what is it? Wall Street has done a really good job of really making people think that that's where their retirement accounts need to go. You put in your $6,000 contribution to your IRA if you're younger than 50, and then you maybe put in a couple mutual funds and let it sit and rinse and repeat until you retire. But the truth is there's actually so much more you can do. So kind of let's get into some of that stuff.
Yeah, of course. I actually like to give a tiny bit of history because most of your listeners won't go this far back. But in 1974, that's when IRAs and 401ks and the stuff we're familiar with now even came into being. So it actually wasn't that long ago. Prior to that, you had pensions. So companies and the government, they guaranteed you a retirement. And actually pensions were a really good deal because they were guaranteed. There was no risk of them, unless they went bankrupt. So what happened is they shift the risk to the employee. So instead of the companies being responsible for retirement, they shifted it to the employee. That's why 401ks and those things came into existence. Well, companies at the time, they weren't set up to invest that money, right? So Wall Street naturally swooped in and said, hey, we can help you. You give us your money and we'll invest it for you. And that's just how it's been set up from the very beginning. And it's been an amazingly profitable business for Wall Street. Well, what people don't know is that within these different retirement plans, you absolutely have the freedom to invest in things outside of Wall Street. And in fact, if you were to look at the IRS code, there's very, very few limitations on what you cannot invest in. In fact, there's only two. You cannot invest in life insurance policies and collectibles. You can't get like collectible cars or art, things like that. Pretty much everything else is fair game. And so a lot of times when I get a broad question like what you just asked, I say it's actually easier to tell you what you can't invest in as opposed to what you can. So believe it or not, I mean, we've seen so many different types of investments, you can't even possibly imagine them. And so it's one of those things, if you think there's a genuine, legitimate investment opportunity, there's a really good chance you could do that with a retirement fund, just like you could with your personal funds.
Wow, that's awesome. I love that. And I love that the IRS, as much as we don't like the IRS, it's nice that they've set us up and provided us with these tools to set us up for retirement. So what does that process look like? Let's say we identify either a business or real estate or something we want to invest in, what does that process look like in terms of, putting those funds into that?
Yeah, I always like to describe it as a 3-step process. So first of all, more than likely, whoever's managing your current retirement funds, it's very unlikely that they're going to let you, for instance, invest in real estate. So just double check. If they let you do it, then you're in the right place. But more than likely, you're going to need to find somebody like New Direction Trust, and there are other custodians like us out there. And you're going to open up an account, and the account itself is actually the exact same account type. We just use the word self-directed. It's a marketing term. It's not an account type. So for example, if you have a Roth IRA, you would open up a Roth IRA with us. It's the same type of account. Once the account is opened, obviously we got to get money into the account, and usually people move money from an existing retirement account. So they either roll it over or transfer it in, or you could do a contribution. You mentioned that $6,000, you can make a contribution. Once the funds are there, you're basically directing us to invest on behalf of the IRA. And so we have procedures in place. So if you wanted to buy a property, your IRA or solo 401k can actually own a property, and we help people through that process.
Awesome. So not really that complicated, which again, I'm sure, something people don't realize, that it's not that complicated. But let's say, 401k, it's with a current, like, I currently am employed and, they have it. Can I move that with you guys?
That's a good question. I'm glad you brought that up. So I break it down into 2 categories. If you have an IRA plan, and it doesn't matter what flavor it is, it could be a traditional, a Roth, a simple, or a SEP. IRAs are portable. What that means is you own those accounts, those you can move. There are no questions. Employer plans, like you mentioned, a 401k, or if you work for a nonprofit, it's a 403b. Employer plans is a little bit different story. Most of the time, while you're employed, the funds are locked up. That being said, if you have funds from a previous employer, because sometimes people work for a while and then they move to another job, any money from a previous employer, that money you can move. And there are not a lot of advantages to getting older, but when you turn 59 and a half, one of the advantages is that's technically where retirement age can begin. It doesn't matter if you're currently employed or not, you are then able to move those funds over. So depending on your age, if you're over 59 and a half, yep. But for most people, while you're currently employed, unfortunately, Wall Street's got their grip on it. They get to set the rules on those plans. And of course, they don't want you to take your money and go.
Interesting. Okay. I appreciate the insight. Definitely good to know. But again, some people have had multiple jobs throughout their life. Like I know I currently still have my old 401k with the previous plan provider. So, important to understand that it's a simple process to kind of move it over. Now I do know, and you can shed some more insight here. There are some things we have to be careful of when we're using these plans to invest, like who we invest in the sense of, who's working for either the business or whatever it is. So kind of give some of the rules behind, you mentioned there's a few things we can't invest in, which obviously means there's a lot, but kind of break down some of the more in-depth rules around some of those investments.
Yeah, of course. Glad you brought that up, because about 1 in 3 calls we get for potential investments, we have to deliver the bad news and say, I'm sorry, but the way the IRS rules are, you can't do that. So a lot of this has to do with who you're investing in. So you nailed it. There's a lot of what you can invest in, but a lot of times it's who you're investing with. So the big idea I like to share with people is that these are typically meant to be arm's length transactions. And so I'll use some real practical examples, because I know you're in the real estate world, and probably a lot of your listeners are going to be in the real estate world. You can definitely buy a house, you can buy a property, but you can't use it yourself. And so that personal use can become an issue. So you can't go live in it, not even for a week. We'll have people call and say, hey, I know you're in the Salt Lake area. Maybe they want to go up to one of the ski resorts and buy a condo. you know, unfortunately, if you're using retirement funds, you can't use it. That has to just be strictly an investment property. And that also applies to some immediate family members. So you, the IRA owner, your spouse, your parents, grandparents, your kids and their spouses, and depending on your age, maybe even grandchildren. So direct blood descendants a lot of times are off limits. But when you get more distant, like aunts, uncles, cousins, they're okay, so to speak. So no personal use. And the other one is that you cannot be paid or compensated as a result of an investment your retirement funds make. So let's use a real estate example. Let's say you own rental house properties and you also do property management and you have a separate company and that company charges for the property management. Well, if you went out, you bought a property using your retirement funds, you can actually do the property management, but you can't pay yourself to do the property management. You can't pay your son or your daughter. So those people I mentioned earlier, they cannot be paid either. So we'll get that question like from fix and flippers. They're like, hey, I want to go in. I like to do a lot of the work myself. And unfortunately, you can't be in there swinging a hammer, doing any of the sweat equity. So that's one of the no-nos with these retirement plans. And here's the big thing, Johnny, that I like to point out is that that's why we're here as the custodian. It's not vital that you know every single rule, because we can help you, and that's our job. You know, our job is to guide you and say, I would not do that. That's going to get you into trouble. Or if you're going to do it, you might want to do it this way. So that's the big takeaway I would say, is that these are meant to be investments. Avoid personal use. Don't get paid, but utilize your custodian. You know, we'll help you understand the rules too.
Awesome. I love that. I appreciate that perspective. So I guess one question the listeners may have, one question I have is, how do they know if you're participating or living in it from time to time or anything like that?
Yeah. And I'm glad you asked that, because that comes up for sure. And I have a grin on my face right now because, you know, we all kind of think of like, well, how, you know, does the IRS have somebody in a van outside my property? No, they don't. So the way that happens typically is one of two ways. One is that somebody's angry. There's a disgruntled person, and believe it or not, sometimes it's a spouse or an ex-spouse, and they know you've done something wrong and they want to inflict pain, so they turn you in. Somebody turns you in. I'm not saying that that happens often or frequently, but it can. The other way that it happens is that you could be involved in a pretty routine audit. And let's say you're a fix and flipper and you have a property, you fixed and you flipped it inside your retirement account. Anytime there's an audit, they have the ability to open up the audit and take a deeper look. So if they take a look at that flip and they're not seeing receipts from contractors, right? What kind of work did you do here? Oh, you tore it all out. We did electrical, plumbing, you know, there could be this huge list. I'm not seeing a receipt for a plumber. I'm not seeing a receipt from the electrician. I'm not seeing, you know, whatever. So not saying that it happens frequently, but, you know, it's one of those things that we definitely don't recommend that you do it. But what we've seen is that that's kind of how those things come up, is that if you just happen to be one of those unlucky few that gets an audit and they decide to start digging around a little deeper, that could be an issue, or somebody just turns you in, unfortunately.
Interesting. Okay, good to know. Another one I've heard is if you're in the proximity, right? If it's a vacation home that you normally Airbnb, then all of a sudden those, you know, 1 week out of every year, your credit card is showing you right in that same area. You know, those kind of things can get you, which is so unfortunate. But listen, again, it's, you know, it's got to be used for, you know, for investing. So.
Yeah, and I just want to mention the penalty, because
Oh
a
yeah.
lot,
Good.
a lot of times when I mention the penalty, it's like, you know, is it worth it? So let's use an IRA as an example. if you bought a property and it was like you're saying, an Airbnb vacation type property, and the IRS catches you, you went, you stayed there, they will distribute the IRA. So anything that's in that IRA, it's a distribution, meaning it gets taxed. And if you're younger than 59 and a half, it's ordinary income tax. It's a 10% early withdrawal penalty. And if it goes back far enough, they're going to charge you interest. In other words, you can count on like 50% just gone in the form of taxes. So it's a severe penalty. And I like to mention it because, you know, it's not worth skating the lines and playing that game. You know, we're always of the view that if you really, really want to use that yourself, then retirement funds may not be the best way to do it.
Awesome. That's great insight. Yeah, that's good to know. I didn't realize hefty penalty, of course, right? I mean, don't just be like, oh yeah, you know, just don't do it again.
Oh, it's definitely not anything like that. So, and I hate to say this, you know, there are some things in life where you'll go out, you'll do something and you'll beg forgiveness. The IRS is not someone to beg forgiveness from. They just don't work that way.
No, quick IRS story to show that they win 10 out of 10 times. So back when I was in college, a lot of my listeners know I didn't end up graduating college, but I did go to college, believe it or not. And back then, I think they still have it, where you automatically got like $2,000 just for being a full-time student. Well, it turns out the college I went to had my social security number transcribed, and I was one of the, is that what they call it, where the numbers are flipped?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And literally the numbers were correct, just flipped at the end. And anyways, long story short, basically what happened, I got chose for an audit, lucky me. And this is like literally no joke, like 4 years later, right? So I'm like, you know, 24, 25 years old, hadn't even thought about it. All of a sudden the IRS is like, oh yeah, so you weren't actually a student these 2 years. We want, you know, a little like $4,000 plus interest. I'm like, oh my gosh, of course. So then
Yeah,
go back, had to dig up receipts, only found enough to prove for 1 year, couldn't find anything for the second year. I had like transfer to like show that I went to school, but that wasn't enough. They needed like credit card receipts, whatever you used to pay. Found it. Finally, like 2 months later, they get back to me. All right, yeah, we know you didn't go to school, but you still owe us for the interest.
jeez. And if you don't pay long enough, they'll find out where you work. They'll garnish your wages. So yeah, you just don't want to get on the bad side. So man, helped. Nope. Boy, an audit at that age, that's rough.
Yeah, I know. I don't even know how it happened. But yeah, and honestly, I'll truth be told, I never paid. They just took money from my tax returns until it's been paid back. So,
and that's the only way
what they'll do,
it.
Right? So
yeah.
They literally kept all of my tax return. Like there was, I think, 3 years where I didn't get anything back, and because, you know, they just were paying it back. So yeah, they'll get their money and they always win. Don't worry. So anyway, kind of speaking along those lines, I know Roth IRAs were kind of on the chopping block a little bit in terms of legislation. Anything you're keeping an eye on, anything in the future that may come up again?
Yeah, I want to address that. And thanks for bringing it up. But I did want to put a plug in for Roth accounts, both Roth IRAs and also Roth 401k. So many of you may have plans at work that allow you to have a Roth 401k. I am an absolutely huge proponent of Roth as an investment vehicle. The ability to invest and grow things tax-free and take it out tax-free later on. If you run the numbers, it just blows everything away. And especially for your younger listeners, if you happen to be in the lower tax brackets, man, do whatever you can to get funds in there. But to address what you were talking about, what the government was wanting to do is they were wanting to eliminate Roth conversions. So they weren't going to get rid of the Roth IRAs, like you couldn't have one anymore. But one of the tools that people use, and I'm one of those people, is the idea of converting funds that are tax deferred. So for example, I have at my employer right now, we have a simple IRA. It's an employer plan. At the end of last year, because I thought these might be going away, I converted the whole thing into the Roth IRA. So the reason the government wants to shut that down is they don't like seeing big dollar amounts going into these Roth IRAs because they're never going to get their tax out of it. So they were trying to shut down that backdoor way of putting more money in. As it sits right now, you mentioned it earlier, you can put $6,000 into a Roth IRA if you're younger than 50 or $7,000 if you're over 50. And so it takes a while to build that up. And so what people are doing is they're converting other accounts so they can get bigger amounts of money in there. I've used it several times throughout my life because I'm a big believer in the Roth. Fortunately, that did not pass. And there were some other nasty things in there. And honestly, we came down to 2 senators who just said, it was called the Build Back Better Act, that just said, you know what, we don't want this. And it just stalled out and it died. But keep your eyes, and it wasn't just, you know, IRAs, there were other things in there, but it's worth keeping an eye out what's going on with your legislation, because there were some, from our perspective, some ugly things in there.
Absolutely. Yeah. And one other thing is they were potentially thinking of taking away some alternative investments in terms of even allowing them inside of retirement accounts. But real quick, kind of explain the difference between traditional and Roth.
Absolutely. So a traditional IRA, or you might have a 401k, most of the retirement money that is out there, it's what's considered tax deferred. So if I put money into a traditional IRA, I get a tax deduction. So what that means is I don't have to pay taxes on the money going in. So you get the benefit up front, but then on the back end is where you will have to pay taxes. So on that traditional IRA, I save the taxes this year, but at some point in the future, when you take the money out, you'll be paying ordinary income. And so you get to pick your poison, if that makes sense. Do I want to save taxes now and pay them later? And the Roth IRA is the exact opposite. You're saying, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and pay my taxes now. I'm going to take a little pain now, but later on, when I go to take that money out, as long as I followed the rules, I can take it out tax-free. I've already paid my taxes. So it's one of those questions, do you want to pay the tax on the seed or the harvest? And if you have a good harvest, I would much rather pay it on the seed in the beginning, because, compounded growth and compounded interest, especially for young people, and the Roth is just an absolutely phenomenal way to go.
Absolutely. And I do want to mention, this is in no way tax advice. Please talk to your CPAs for more advice, because there are some things, and we can kind of touch on these real quick. For instance, Roth, I believe, has a income hurdle, right? Like once you make a certain amount per year, you can no longer contribute to a Roth. Is that correct?
Yep, that's correct. And these numbers, I'm going to ballpark them because they've changed a little bit, but in the ballpark of about 140,000 if you're a single filing as a single taxpayer. And then married filing jointly is in the ballpark of 220,000. So if you go above those limits, you're not eligible for the Roth IRA contribution. But what people do, we talked about this earlier, is that you can still make a contribution to a traditional IRA, and then you do a backdoor conversion to a Roth. And so that was what they were trying to cut out, was they didn't want wealthy people putting money into Roth accounts. Basically, they're trying to shut that down on folks. So, but yes, there are income limitations. And to your point, just check with a CPA or someone that's competent with taxes.
Absolutely. And the irony is that these are all people pretty close to retirement age making these laws that are hurting themselves, because like I was a stockbroker, I know people are absolutely doing this, and high net worth people are doing it, of course, because why wouldn't you? And so these exact senators and everyone are doing it, right? I mean, it's not illegal. There's nothing, just because it's called a backdoor, it's not some like little loophole thing that you got to know someone. It's like, no, this is available. It's just, that's what it's called, because it starts in the traditional and then gets converted once it's already there. So,
Yep.
so that's kind of the irony, is that,
Yes.
all of them are utilizing this exact strategy, and yet they're like, well, we need to get rid of this. But anyway.
It's interesting. There were some other rules in there, and your listeners have probably heard of Mitt Romney, of course, right? And Peter Thiel. And both of those gentlemen, and there are others out there, they did a lot of their investing inside Roth IRAs. And so Peter Thiel, he's an attorney in Silicon Valley, and he works with startups. So PayPal's one example, but he's been involved in a bunch of them. He has a $5 billion billion-dollar Roth IRA. And the fact of the matter is, it's kind of this Robin Hood thing. It's like, a lot of times our lawmakers, they don't think it's fair that somebody's been successful, and and by the way, he was audited. It wasn't like he did anything illegal, but it just doesn't seem fair that somebody has that much money and it's in a Roth where they can't touch it, they can't tax it. And so some of the other rules that were involved, where they wanted to limit how much money people could have in retirement accounts, they were going to force people to take money out of those plans. So there was a lot of ugly stuff. But if really, really smart people, high net worth people like that, are using that account, that should be a really big clue that maybe I should look into this. And I know when I see those kind of things, it's like eye-opening to me. And I'm like, hey, if they're doing it, they know what's going on. I'm going to jump on board.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Well, I've appreciated all the insight. Really quick, I do want to know, when all this was coming to light, obviously a lot of stuff going around, like, hey, reach out to your legislators, that kind of thing. Were you getting more phone calls and people kind of starting to be like, hey, I want to do this, how do I do this?
Big time. Absolutely. And the clients we work with specifically, a lot of the rules were targeted at them. And so they had a very vested interest. And so we had very organized campaigns where we were providing literally the language that they could send to the senators, helping them understand how to even contact their congressmen and their senators, because a lot of people have no idea, how do I even do that? And so a lot of it was education, letting them know how to contact them, but then also what to say. I think what ended up happening, honestly, in the long run, is politics is a game of who you know. And I think the right people knew the right legislators to connect with, to say, I don't think you really understand what the implications of what you're wanting to do are. And we were able to get through to enough legislators to say, if you do this, there's some negative implications. There's some bad things that are going to come out of this. And they maybe didn't even know, because there was so much in there. And I mean, that thing was like a huge old phone book of stuff. And so there was just a lot of stuff in there. And a lot of these legislators had no idea what was even in there, what they were voting on.
Absolutely. You're talking about potentially unwinding trillions of dollars worth of, stock positions and alternative assets. I know there was even a talk of having to liquidate these alternative assets so they weren't even in your account, so then you're talking about illiquid investments all of a sudden needing to be liquidated. So it would have been a huge mess, and I'm glad that that it didn't pass, and we don't have to worry about it. Yeah. Awesome. Well, like I said, we are unfortunately running up against time. I appreciate all of your insight, but I do have 5 questions that I ask all of my guests. It's the final 5. So first question is, what's the best advice you've gotten from a mentor?
It's interesting the way you ask the question, because the answer is in your question. And that is, whatever the investment is, don't be a lone wolf and try and do these things on your own. There are seasoned, experienced people out there, mentors, you just put that in your question, who can help guide you. And I am guilty of at times thinking I knew all the information, I knew the answers, and inevitably it seems like I learned the hard way. Whatever it is you want to do, find somebody that's doing it, that's good at it, and learn from them, use them as a mentor. And I found most people are willing to help other people out, that are sincere and really want to learn. That would be the best advice I ever got. Don't do it all on your own.
I love it. It's so true. You know, find someone who's doing what you want to do. And I promise they were right where you were at one point. So awesome. What is it about your career that makes you feel like you're fulfilling your why?
That's awesome. And I'm going to go back to when I was working that job that was pretty volatile, where things were going well, and then all of a sudden I'm laid off. I literally get a chance to teach people to become more self-sufficient. And I've watched people, I was at a conference recently where a gal 6 years ago was at the exact same meeting, exact same topic. We were talking about creative financing and real estate, who's a young mom with young children and was working a job. And now 6 years later, she was one of the instructors teaching. And so she totally transformed her life. And one of the tools, and that was not the only thing, but one of the tools was what I teach with these self-directed plans. And so this helps people become more self-sufficient. And because I've been there, I've felt the pain and the stress of relying on that job.
Wow. Awesome. I love that. Thanks for sharing. Favorite non-real estate or investment related book?
This goes way back. I read this book. It was called Man's Search for Meaning. And it was written, this name may or may not be right, but basically it was a gentleman who was a psychiatrist. He was a doctor in a concentration camp.
Oh, wow.
He talks about his experiences, but what's interesting is he talks about man's will to survive. Like, he couldn't ever predict who was going to survive and who wouldn't. And it was kind of a good lesson. And you talked a little bit earlier about the why, and there has to be a purpose or a why in your life. And that was an eye-opening book I read all the way back in high school. And I think the author was Viktor Frankl. Man's Search for Meaning. You could probably read it in one night. It's not a long book, but it's an interesting one.
Wow. Interesting. Okay. I like that. So true. The will to live is very much a real thing. I believe that. If you could have any superpower, what would it be?
I would like to have a crystal ball that would let me see what the future looks like.
Yeah, that would be amazing, right?
So the ability to see the future would be pretty awesome. Either you could help affect change, or you could benefit from it, or whatever, but that would be a pretty cool superpower.
Absolutely. Awesome. And last one, what's the best way for people to get a hold of you and learn more?
So a couple of ways. One, just to learn about self-directed IRAs, please visit our website, www.ndtco.com. The NDTCO is the initials of the company, New Direction Trust Company. They can reach me by email, and my email address is ctanner, so CTANNER at ndtco.com. So the same initials that are in the website. And happy to talk with anyone that's interested in learning more.
Awesome. We will link that in the show notes. Chris, thank you so much for all of your time. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Johnny. Appreciate it. It's been fun.
Absolutely. Likewise. Hey guys, thank you so much for watching today's episode. I hope you really enjoyed it. Listen, I know it's cliche and you hear it all the time, but please don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you know when the next video is coming out. Even though this is technically a daily podcast, you know it's coming out the next day. We have a ton of content coming your way. So please like and subscribe. It helps a ton. Leave comments. Would love to know what you guys think. And we will see you on the next one. Thanks so much.